All right, I think that's a good way to get into our AFC North preview. We looked at the AFC East earlier in the week. So, again, we're going to go in order of last year's finish within the division, which starts us with the Cincinnati Bengals. They were 10-7 in 2021, made it all the way to the Super Bowl before losing to the eventual champion Rams. Their passing leader last year, no surprise, Joe Burrow, just over 4,600 yards, 34 touchdowns, 14 interceptions. You had Joe Mixon as the leading rusher. He had 1,205 rushing yards, 13 rushing touchdowns, was the RB4. And Jamar Chase, who you talked about, this time last year, he was blind and had skillets for hands. But he ended up with 81 catches, which is pretty good for a guy who apparently couldn't see. 1,455 yards, 13 touchdowns, the wide receiver 5. That gets us to, it's time for Going Strong, presented by Castrol Edge. So, as we talk about guys who could be going strong this year, Joe Burrow was a QB 8, I believe, just outside the top 5. Obviously, there's a lot of excitement around this offense. Will Joe Burrow finish as a top 5? I know he can, but will he finish as a top 5 quarterback?
I have him just outside the top 5. He's my QB 7 right now coming into this year. And it's nothing against Joe Burrow. It's just the quarterbacks ahead of him. Josh Allen, Justin Herbert, Jalen Hurts, Kyler Murray, Lamar Jackson, that whole group. They all can run. Patrick Mahomes, they all run, whereas it's something that we haven't seen Joe Burrow. As I'm talking, there's a highlight of him running here, but that doesn't happen too often from Joe Burrow. He's more of a pocket-type passer. For him to be top 5, I think he would need a season like Brady or Rodgers have had in recent years where you're not only heavy volume, but you're also highly, highly efficient. I don't want to bank on that, so I'll have him just outside the top 5.
I think to that point, I went back and I looked over the last 3 seasons, and the median rushing total, like the number right in the middle when you put out together all the rushing yards for your top 5 quarterbacks, that median total was 342. Now, in 2 seasons, Burrow's at 260 career rushing yards. That's 2 years combined, so he hasn't quite gotten to that number. And as you talked about, with Rodgers, when he finished top 5, he had a season with, 40-something touchdowns and 5 interceptions. Brady threw for over 5,000 yards and, nearly 50 touchdowns. So I don't know that Burrow is going to do enough as a passer to offset what he does as a runner. So I'm with you. I don't think he finishes at the top 5, but I think 7, 8, right around where he was last year. I think that's doable. I think that's fine. You draft a top 10 quarterback, there's really very little for you to complain about.
And if you want Joe Burrow, you should be happy that we're saying this, because if we were like, yeah, he's a lock to get top 5, then people are going to start drafting him top 5. So take the discount.
So you are welcome. We're helping you. And you're right. We talk about him not running. There's all these highlights of him running. So I don't know. We need to talk to our production staff about that. Looking elsewhere on this roster, I mentioned Joe Mixon was the RB4 last year. What is the earliest that you'd be willing to take him in a draft?
First round, late first round. I wouldn't take him in the early part of the drafts. For me, I'm taking Jonathan Taylor, Christian McCaffrey, Austin Eckler, or I'm taking a receiver. But when you get back to the late part of the first round, like Dalvin Cook, Joe Mixon, Najee Harris, I think that is a tier that should all be going together. And it seems to me like Joe Mixon gets knocked the lowest of that bunch, which means that I've actually drafted him more than the other guys because I think they're all very comparable.
I think if I am really hungry for a running back in the first round, I could reach as high as 5. That's maybe the highest I would think about reaching for Joe Mixon, because I think sort of like we talk about with Joe Burrow, right? I think when you talk about your elite level running backs, either they put up bananas rushing yards and rushing touchdown totals like you saw with Jonathan Taylor or Derrick Henry, or they catch a ton of passes, right? You got your Christian McCaffreys, your Austin Ecklers. Mixon does a little bit of both, but I don't think he does any one of those things to an extreme level.
Yeah.
He scored double-digit touchdowns this past year for the first time ever in his career. I'm not sure that he can duplicate that. So I don't think he's quite amongst the elite running backs, but he's kind of in that second tier right below. So I think 5th, that's the highest I would go, and even that might be a little too high, because I think if you're sitting at 5, I would also think about a Cooper Kupp, a Justin Jefferson, somebody like that in that spot.
That's the difference for me between this. It's the second tier running backs for me. Mixon's right in there because, like you said, he's not in the elite group. The elite group I'll take over the elite wide receivers, but the secondary tier I'll take Justin Jefferson, Cooper Kupp, Jamar Chase over them.
So I think that's why you're starting to see, or you have been seeing, Joe Mixon sort of settle into that mid to late part of the first round in a lot of drafts. All right, like we did on Monday, we'll do it again. First player drafted, a sleeper, and a player to avoid. And just for the sake of the audience, you and I were talking before the show. For the AFC North, it was sort of hard to come up with maybe some sleepers and some players to avoid because a lot of these teams, everything seems pretty clear cut. But I will leave it to you to try.
It is exactly what you said. It is very clear cut. The first player drafted, I think, should be Jamar Chase. I think Jamar Chase should be like a top 6 pick for me. I think the upside is that high, and I know people are saying on fantasy Twitter and stuff like he only had 120 something targets last year. What if that happens again? It's like he was a top 3 wide receiver on that little targets. What if he gets 150 this year? He could literally break fantasy football. So Jamar Chase, I think, should be the first Bengal to go off the board. And then this is where it gets tough. Like you said, sleeper, I went with Hayden Hurst.
Okay.
Because kind of athletic tight end, who last year CJ Uzama was like a streamable option. I could see Hurst kind of filling into that role. I don't think he'll be like top 12 tight end or anything. And this one might hurt you a little bit, Marcus.
Okay.
My player to avoid was Tyler Boyd. Only because I'm thinking that Jamar Chase and T. Higgins are each going to get 25 to 30% target share.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they're going to clearly be the full. And then you have Joe Mixon getting his touches. I'm just not sure there's enough to go around for Tyler Boyd, who in the past has been a little bit more volume dependent because he's not like a field stretcher or touchdown scorer.
So I've been trying to show my kid, movies lately, and a couple weeks ago I tried to sit him down and watch Toy Story, which, for the record, he watched Toy Story for like 10 minutes, and the rest of it was me sitting and watching Toy Story, which I'm perfectly fine with. And like when we talk about Tyler Boyd, it reminds me of Woody, right? Like a couple years ago, Tyler Boyd was the thing, and everybody loved him. And Jamar Chase is Buzz Lightyear,
He's got
and
the
now
wings shooting out, he talks. No one wants the cowboy anymore.
Right, all of a sudden, they're like Tyler Boyd is like Woody, and it's just like, I don't want to play with you anymore. Like that's like what I feel like with him. For me, I'm going to say Joe Mixon's the first guy off the board. And I understand the argument for Jamar Chase. I think they're going to be very close to each other in drafts. So I'm going to say Joe Mixon's going to be the first guy off the board. My sleeper, it was a hard one to come up with. I went with Samaje Perine, understanding that he does need an injury or something to happen to get more opportunity, but he does look like the RB2 right now, despite everyone sort of trying to plant their flag with Chris Evans. The only Chris Evans I recognize carries a shield with a star on it.
I was going to say, there's a Captain America joke there.
Right,
your flag, Chris
carries
Evans.
a shield with a star on it right now, so I'm not really behind this Chris Evans so much. But I understand that for Perine to be fantasy relevant, some things have to happen, but I do think there's a path for that. For me, the guy to avoid, and this was tough, I kind of went with the Bengals tight ends, mostly because Burrow really doesn't target the position all that much. And you mentioned CJ Uzama was a streamable option, but even then you were still sort of hoping that he catches a touchdown because the target share just wasn't there when you talk about Chase and Higgins and Boyd and whomever else. It's just a hard thing to sort of lean on. But this was kind of a tough group.
I think the player to avoid could be like anyone not named Chase, Mixon, Burrow, Higgins.
Pretty much.
You could make the argument there. Like after those 4 are gone, it's not a whole lot to like here.
It's pretty much wide open after that for the Bengals. So next up, we've got the Pittsburgh Steelers as we continue our look at the AFC North. 9-7-1 in 2021. They lost in the wild card round to the Kansas City Chiefs. And again, I went back and looked. I think the final score was 42-21. But if I remember, that game wasn't really that close.
It was of all the playoff games, it was easily the one that was like the least competitive.
Oh, I feel like that was the one where I started watching it and I'm like, oh, I can go run some errands. Or
that was it. That and the Bucks Eagles. I was like, these are the games I'm getting everything done for the week.
This is like I'm gonna go to Target or do whatever I need to do right now because this game's not really competitive. But let's look at their leaders from last season. Ben Roethlisberger in his final year, 3,740 yards, 22 touchdowns, 10 interceptions, was the QB 21. Najee Harris, 1,200 rushing yards, 7 rushing touchdowns. That made him the RB3. What I'm sort of leaving out, and we'll talk about this in just a minute, the fact that he had 74 catches as well, that boosted that overall fantasy total for him. Receiving-wise, Deontay Johnson, 107 catches, over 1,100 receiving yards, 8 receiving touchdowns. He was the wide receiver 8. But getting back to Najee Harris, he was the RB3 last year. He's being drafted as a top 5 or 6 running back so far this year. What are the odds that he is? I wrote that he's a bust, but at least, let's not go that far, but at least a disappointment in 2022.
So I was saying when we were talking about Joe Mixon that like Najee's in my top like 6-7 running backs, but of that early group of running backs, Najee Harris I think has the highest chance of disappointment. winning this year and potentially being a bust. He was so volume dependent last year, and I don't expect the ground volume to change, especially if they use like a unproven quarterback, which they're going to be using. I expect a lot of run from Najee Harris. I think the reception total is going to drop because, one, it was inflated last year by a 19-target game where Juju and Deontay Johnson didn't play. But also, like, Big Ben last year averaged like 6 air yards per throw. So a dump off to Najee Harris and Big Ben airing it out type throw were almost identical. And Big Ben feeling pressure, he's a statue. Like, he wasn't able to run or anything last year. So the moment he felt pressure, he's like, where's Najee Harris dumping it off? It's better than me taking a sack. Kenny Pickett, Mitch Trubisky, whichever one it's going to be. I don't think it'll be Mason Rudolph. If you want Najee Harris to get catches, though, I guess that's the best route. But those other two quarterbacks are both mobile, so when they feel pressure, I think they'll scramble rather than just trying to get the ball out of their hands right away.
The reception number is the one I think definitely comes down this year. 74 catches, as I mentioned last season. You look at the top 10 backs with the most catches last year. According to Next Gen Stats, Najee Harris was the only one with a negative average route depth. It was negative 0.6, which I know is not a big negative number, but basically what it means is that most of the time he was at or slightly behind the line of scrimmage when he was running his routes, which means a lot of times he was sort of that emergency outlet when things were starting to get hot in the pocket for Ben Roethlisberger. Now you look at who's going to be the quarterback. You mentioned Trubisky, Kenny Pickett. Both guys are a little more mobile, I guess a lot more mobile than Ben Roethlisberger was. Plus, Trubisky has not been known for heavily targeting running backs through his career. I mean, he is going, for better or worse, to push the ball downfield. So if that number comes down, that's a lot that comes off of his fantasy total. Now, someone has suggested to me that maybe he gets more efficient targets this year, that maybe they're a little bit more downfield, and maybe that sort of makes up the difference. But I think that catch number comes down significantly, and that's going to be a big chunk off of his totals.
He's still a running back, though. You know, like how much more downfield right. is it really going to be?
Right. I mean, he's not. Yeah, right. We're not talking. He's not Austin Eckler, right? Who's running legitimate routes on occasion. He's more. You know, we're going to slide out and offer an outlet when we need to. The other question here is, who is the wide receiver 2? We know Deontay Johnson's the wide receiver 1. That is not up for debate. But there are some other guys there that are fighting for that number 2 target slot. Who do you think ends up winning that?
I don't know if it'll be like week 1 he wins it, but I think come the end of the year, George Pickens will be this team's wide receiver 2. First, he is stealing headlines every day out of Pittsburgh Steelers camp right now. Apparently today he had an amazing catch in the end zone from Kenny Pickett to end practice. And the thing about George Pickens is the talent is there. We know it. It was off the field issues that led to him sliding in the draft. Otherwise, a lot of people thought this guy was going to be a potential first round pick. He also had some injuries in college that kind of hurt his numbers a little bit, but he is, when I watched like his tape and stuff, I was like, this guy is a true alpha wide receiver 1 who could really do anything on the football field. So I think that paired with the fact that like Chase Claypool's been in some weird situations in Pittsburgh where like Mike Tomlin doesn't really seem to be his fan. My joke on draft night was like, they sent Chase Claypool out to announce his replacement. But so I'm going to go with Pickens, but I also could see it just being like these two battling all year.
I do wonder if Chase Claypool and Mike Tomlin have come to some sort of Spotify type agreement about like playlists and who gets the auxiliary cord and that sort of thing. I'm going to lean with Chase Claypool as the guy who's the wide receiver 2. There's been a lot of talk about him maybe playing in the slot this year and the Steelers using him as kind of a big slot receiver, which seems to be a trend across the NFL. Maybe get him in situations where he has better matchups. You know, I know he said earlier this offseason he thinks he can be he thinks he could be the best receiver in the NFL or a top 3 receiver. I mean, look, I appreciate the fact that he's got that level of confidence.
He's not even the best on his own team,
right? Even if we don't necessarily believe in you that way, you got to believe in yourself that way. So I think moving to the slot helps him out in terms of getting a few more easier targets. If it is Trubisky, he is a guy who did spend a lot of time targeting slot receivers. So I think he can get that number 2 wide receiver job, but I do think it's not going to be a clear-cut number 2. I think it's going to be kind of murky.
As you were saying him in the slot, the first thing I thought of was like he could be the new Juju, where like he's like in that slot exclusively, getting a lot of those short targets with they run after the catch. And then Pickens potentially could be the new Claypool, who's like the field stretcher on the outside, who is going to be, that would lead to him being very inconsistent for fantasy.
That, you see, those field stretchers, we said it before, really great in best ball.
Yeah.
They're really great in best ball. All right, so let's get to it. First Steeler drafted, a sleeper, and a player to avoid.
My first Steeler drafted, even though we were kind of worried about him, it's 100% Najee Harris. He's still a first-round caliber type of player. There's no other Steeler that goes really even that close to him. Deontay would be the closest. My sleeper is George Pickens for everything I was saying about him. My player to avoid is Chase Claypool, but that's only because I think Claypool and Pickens could have very similar stats come the end of the year. And Claypool, because he's the known name and the known commodity, he's the one going earlier. If Pickens and Claypool's ADP were to flip, my answers for this would flip.
Well, I'm going to go the first two the same as you got, right? I got Najee Harris as the first guy off the board, George Pickens as the sleeper, even though, certainly in fantasy Twitter, the drum beats have been loud for him. In fact, you talk about the stuff out of camp. I'm watching my Twitter feed this morning, and Mark Caboli, who's one of the beat writers in Pittsburgh, just had a tweet that said, "Holy bleep, George Pickens." And I was like, okay, well,
that ADP went up around.
That ADP definitely shot up at this point. For me, the player to avoid is whoever the Steelers quarterback is.
That's a great answer.
That player, obviously, whoever's starting has more value, but it's not enough that I'm willing to take a shot at that player and draft him. I just don't think there's going to be enough there. So whether it's Trubisky or Kenny Pickett, or if it is Mason Rudolph some way in some upset, I am staying away from Steelers quarterbacks in this draft. So. Over to Cleveland and taking a look at the Browns, who were 8-9 in 2021. And I don't know about you, but seeing 8-9 still sort of makes my brain itch a little bit.
Yeah,
I'm used to 8-8, 7-9, but 8-9 still makes my brain itch a little bit. But all right, so let's look at the passing leader from last year, Baker Mayfield. Just over 3,000 yards, 17 touchdowns, 13 picks, was the QB 25, and now he's collecting mail in Charlotte. The rushing leader, Nick Chubb, 1,259 yards, 8 rushing touchdowns. He was the RB 13. Receiving, this was sort of ugly when I went and looked at this. The leader by receiving yards was Donovan Peoples-Jones, and that shook me up when I saw that. 34 catches for 597 yards and 3 touchdowns. He was the wide receiver 64. If you're doing it by receptions, then it was Jarvis Landry, who caught 52 passes for 570 yards. What in the name of Julian Edelman is that? 2 touchdowns, wide receiver 52. Woof. The Browns obviously have had a lot of changes in the offseason. They bring in Deshaun Watson, whose fate we're still sort of waiting on. We know at the moment that we're recording this, he has a 6-game suspension, but that very well could change. We're not sure when. They bring in Amari Cooper as well, who ostensibly is the wide receiver 1. So I know this is sort of a loaded question depending on other factors, but how high are you willing to draft Amari Cooper?
Not high at all. Like he is someone that when they got Deshaun Watson and we didn't know what was going to happen, I was like, if Deshaun plays all year, Amari Cooper is a dark horse to be the wide receiver 1. I think his upside is very high, but we have no idea right now what is going to happen in this situation, and his value is so directly tied to that quarterback position that like in a best ball draft earlier today, he was the best available receiver in ADP, and I took Kadarius Toney over him. So like I'm really letting Amari Cooper just slide. He'd have to fall a good amount past the top 30 wide receivers, I think.
I think for me, it really is dependent on what we learn about the quarterback situation. If the suspension for Watson stays at 6 games, and we know he's going to be there for the last 2/3 of the season, I would take a swing at him probably around the 5th or 6th round. I think there's potential there as maybe your 3rd wide receiver. If, as some people surmise, Deshaun Watson's gone for the full year, it's double digits for me. It really is double digits, because I think if it's Jacoby Brissett, you're looking at, I think I went back in the years where Jacoby Brissett was a starter, I think his leading receiver might have had like just over 900 yards, and that was sort of T.Y. Hilton at the height of his powers, sort of thing. I don't know that Amari Cooper is quite there and can salvage that with a Jacoby Brissett. I think if we have Brissett for 17 games, I think for Cooper, you're looking at 750, 800 yards, something like that. It's not great.
If you're an opposing defensive coordinator, you're going to be like, everyone cover this
Just go
guy.
stand next to him.
We don't need to worry about the others. Like, it's not a great situation.
It really isn't. And it trickles down beyond that to the running back spot. And we've talked about this a fair amount in the last couple of weeks. What happens for Nick Chubb? So I was looking at sort of ADPs and guys that were around him. So I'm going to ask, who would you rather have on your roster, similar ADPs, Nick Chubb, Javonte Williams, or Leonard Fournette? I know for me, it was kind of an easy call here.
Yeah, this Leonard Fournette's my guy.
Yeah.
I'm glad you agree because I think he could catch, 75-plus passes this year from Tom Brady if he is the lead back, like I suspect at least. I think Leonard Fournette could easily be a top 5 running back this year, and he's not getting that love, I think, because he's Leonard Fournette, and I think people get fatigued with him or whatever, or he comes into weight.
Right,
coming to the camp overweight, but
he showed up one value meal overweight or whatever, and people were like, "Oh no, it's all over."
I love that he was like, "Yeah, I enjoy my off season." I'm like, as you should, Leonard Fournette, dude. But yeah, and I would take Chubb over Javonte though. I think that he's much safer. Javonte Williams, I think, is being overrated just because of what the ceiling is, but there's a lot that has to go right for him to get that ceiling.
There's Melvin Gordon is still breathing. He's still upright and collecting a paycheck in Denver. So that to me knocks Javonte down.
And we're not going to get 500 touches out of the running backs with Russell Wilson there. I don't think, at least.
No, I don't think you are either. Fournette, as you mentioned, he's the guy who's going to catch the most passes out of this group. And he's the only one that, at least right now, projects to be a 3-down back there. I know fantasy Twitter, I know dynasty Twitter especially loves Rachaad White, but he's still down the depth chart a little bit. Keyshawn Vaughn, I guess, will kind of be there to give Fournette a rest occasionally, but Fournette and Tom Brady, they have trust in one another, and people know that Fournette can pick up and pass protection when they need to. We know he can catch the football, and I'm not worried he will shed some LBs before we get to week 1. So I just don't think that's a story here. And I'm with you. I don't understand why Fournette's going as late as he is, but I'm cool with it.
Fantasy Twitter has always loved Leonard Fournette's backup running back, and outside of the James Robinson year, they've never been right. It's always Leonard Fournette's job.
Although it's funny. So I was in a salary cap mock draft last night, and I will say that the people I was drafting with seemed to like Leonard Fournette because he went for a pretty decent salary in that one. So while I think a lot of maybe snake drafts are sort of disrespecting him, I feel like he's getting the proper respect when it comes to salary cap draft.
I haven't done one yet, so I have one coming up in a couple of weeks. I'm excited to see how that goes. But in a snake draft, Leonard Fournette being available in the second round, to me, is every reason to take a receiver in round 1, because then I could get Chase, Jefferson, Kupp, something like that, and then pair him with a Leonard Fournette, who I think could be a top 5 running back. I love that start.
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty solid. All right, so for the Browns, and this was another fairly difficult one for me to put together at least. First player drafted, sleeper, player to avoid.
First player drafted should be Nick Chubb, I think. He's going to get enough work. He also said this year he's tired of finishing as the second leading rushing yards running back, so he wants the title this year.
It's good to want things.
He's invested, I guess. My sleeper is David Njoku, who I've always believed in talent-wise. He's just struggled to put it all together, but the Browns got rid of Austin Hooper and then made this guy like a top 5 or top 7 paid tight end in football. So I think David Njoku is someone to keep an eye on there. Player to avoid, man, it could be pretty much all of them. But I decided to go spicy and say Amari Cooper because it's all about the price. And I agree with you. If Deshaun Watson is there for 2/3 of the season, 5th, 6th round sounds great. But right now, you're kind of having to take him in that range. And we have no idea what that season, the whole season could look like for him. So I'll just keep my hands clean and let someone else have that headache.
Which is why I haven't drafted Amari Cooper anywhere, because you are having to pay that price without knowing, what you're getting in terms of pass catchers there. I'm with you. Nick Chubb, first one off the board without a doubt. My sleeper is Dearness Johnson. And I know the Browns say they don't want to trade Kareem Hunt, but I don't know. Me thinks at some point they might trade Kareem Hunt, which opens up an opportunity for Dearness Johnson, who we saw last year when Hunt and or Chubb were injured. Johnson was great in that role, and I think that if Hunt moves out of the way, that I think Johnson slides in and is going to be fantastic. For me, I'm avoiding any non-Amari Cooper wide receiver. It's if it's DPJ, I know David Bell's a guy that people sort of like, but Again, that was all sort of predicated on who the quarterback was going to be. I think even with Jacoby Brissett, Cooper still gets a lot of targets, so he at least keeps some fantasy relevance, even if it's not great. Beyond that, there's nobody that I really want any part of in that offense.
Nope.
It's gonna be a weird year in Cleveland. We're just gonna keep an eye on kind of what it had the potential to be really good. Now it's just a lot of question marks around there. Rounding out our preview of the AFC North, it's the Baltimore Ravens. They were also 8-9, but because of tiebreakers, they finished last in the division in 2021. Injuries, a big part of the story in Baltimore last year. But the passing and rushing leader, same guy, Lamar Jackson, 2,882 yards, passing, 16 touchdowns, 13 interceptions. He was the QB 15. The rushing leader, also Lamar Jackson, 767 yards. Just 2 rushing touchdowns for Lamar, which right, feels really low. The receiving leader, Mark Andrews, 107 catches, 1,361 yards, 9 receiving touchdowns, and he kicked Travis Kelce off the throne as the top tight end in the fantasy game. He is your tight end 1 at the end of last season. But let's talk about Lamar Jackson specifically, because we saw a couple of years ago, he was the league MVP. He had a huge rushing total, was not only he finishes the QB1, but also if you just broke out his rushing numbers, I think it was like a top 15 running back as well. He's still going off the board as a top 5 quarterback right now. But when you look at his fantasy history, only once has he ever finished as a top 5 quarterback. That was 2019, his MVP year. Beyond that, he's never done it. So is he actually a top 5 quarterback, or are we just sort of going off of what we hope and believe can happen?
A little bit of each, I think. But I very much so have him as a top 5 fantasy quarterback. In fact, he's my QB3 in my rankings. I'm pretty high on him. Look at what he did last year despite missing all that time. 767 rushing yards. Like, of all the rushing quarterbacks, there's arguably one that you could say confidently can rush for 1,000 yards in any season, and it's Lamar Jackson. So he gives you RB1 production on the ground. And then I think last year when he was healthy, he was throwing the ball better than he ever has. So I'm hoping that we can see that continue. We could get a little bit of an uptick in the passing numbers with these same old Lamar Jackson rushing numbers. I've gone back and forth between like him versus Jalen Hurts, but he's safer to me than Jalen Hurts. Him versus Kyler Murray, I think his ceiling is higher than Kyler's. Him versus Mahomes, to me, I'm like, Mahomes is better in real life, but he doesn't have Tyreek Hill now. He's not going to run like Lamar. So the result, I know we're getting nitpicky when we're talking about like the elite of the elite guys, but for me, Lamar just felt like he brought the right combination of like a very safe floor, but also a very high ceiling.
I think when we're talking about the elites, I think we sort of have to get nitpicky because we're trying to just separate great from great. I'm probably not going to make a lot of friends with this. I don't think he's a top 5 quarterback. And I say that as somebody who early in the offseason had him in my rankings in the top 5. But as I'm going through this, getting ready for this show, I'm starting to break it down. And I know the ceiling is there, but can he reach it again? And so far, he only has one 3,000-yard passing season in his career, and that was, again, his MVP year where he ran for 1,200 yards. And he's sort of the reverse of Joe Burrow, where we talked about Burrow as a passer being good, but not really much of a runner. And I think for Lamar, he's a great runner. He's a good, but not necessarily great passer, and he doesn't, I think, have enough pass catchers around him to elevate him to that next level. Mark Andrews is very good. Rashad Bateman, we think, can be very good. Beyond that, I mean, who's catching the ball that we're really excited about? There's nobody there. So in order for Lamar to be that top 5 guy, he does have to run for 1,000, 1,100 yards. He does have to give you 5 to 7 rushing touchdowns. And on top of that, he has to get you back to 3,000 passing yards, which he's only done once in his career. So I understand why we're drafting him as a top 5 QB. Like I said, I had him in my top 5 quarterbacks, but I just worry that we are sort of projecting him at his ceiling right now, and it's a ceiling that he really has only hit once in his career.
Question: this is purely like philosophy type question. He's playing for like a contract this year. Do you think that inspires him? Do you not put weight into that?
I think it's a nice thing to talk about, but I think on a week-to-week basis when he steps on the field, like I don't think he's thinking like, hey man, I got to get X number of yards to get my numbers up to get my contract. Like I think over the course of a season, I think it's something he can put on tape, but I think it's hard to put any weight into that on any given week. But it's fun to talk about.
He's his own agent too, so you think like he hypes him like, if you get this many yards today, they're gonna give you this much money.
You think he's talking to like the film, the film department there in the Ravens, like, hey, I need you to cut this off for me so I can put this on my reel, that sort of thing. Yeah, I don't know.
Just put like that. YouTube videos out there, like trying to get attention.
I don't know, man. Talk to Odell Beckham's dad. Maybe he can put together some clips for you and like use some Final Cut Pro, put it on YouTube, and help you get a bigger contract. So obviously Lamar is going to run the football a lot, but they do have actual honest-to-goodness running backs, one of whom is J.K. Dobbins, who's back after missing all of last year. What are your expectations for Dobbins this year?
He's one of the harder players for me to figure out this season because he has tremendous upside, I think. I think he showed us that when he was healthy that he can be an RB1, and I think his path to being so is a lot like Mark Ingram's was in 2019 when he scored double-digit touchdowns and rushed for 1,000 yards, because I don't know how involved in the passing game he'll be, which gives me concerns. Also, he's not like fully back yet at camp. Mm-hmm. I think to me, he belongs as like a low-end RB2 who has the upside of being an RB1, but I think the people who love J.K. Dobbins do kind of sugarcoat the volatility that he can bring. I say this. I think this year we see him get maybe more carries than we've seen out of a Ravens running back in some time. You go back to, I think it was 2018, the last time a Ravens running back had more than 200 carries, and that was that Mark Ingram year. I think he can get that just because while Dobbins is still sort of working his way back, he's a lot closer to being back than, say, Gus Edwards. Yeah.
And, I don't know if it's, Justice Hill is just coming back. I think Corey Clement is there. There's nobody else there that I think you can count on to have a heavy role in this offense. But the pass catching is a concern. I think at best you're looking at 30, 35 targets for him this year. I don't think any Ravens running back has had an extreme number of targets as long as Lamar Jackson has been there, and I don't see that changing this season. So you are talking about needing him to get a good rushing total, some good rushing touchdown totals. I'm not necessarily certain that happens because Lamar's still going to take a whole bunch of those carries on his own. But I do think he has a ceiling as a strong RB2, and I think that's sort of where I'm pegging him this year. It's not what we thought last year. I think a lot of us believed the breakout was coming. Then, unfortunately, the injury happened, and he missed the entire season. But I am cautiously optimistic about J.K. Dobbins this year.
I think that's the right approach.
Yeah. All right, so with the Ravens, first player drafted, sleeper, and your player to avoid.
First player drafted, I think, should be Mark Andrews. Elite tight ends are worth taking in the early rounds, and he was the tight end 1 last year. I go back and forth between him and Travis Kelce as my tight end 1, but he belongs in that group. Sleeper, Isaiah Likely is getting a lot of hype out of camp, but it's hard to be a second tight end, so I'll just go with Devin Duvernay, right, who I know has gotten some hype as their potential wide receiver 2. We know he's got speed. Players to avoid, man, it's like the entire team outside of Lamar, Rashad Bateman, Mark Andrews, and J.K. Dobbins. Like I'll say they're running backs because I have some concerns with them, and I'm not as bullish on Dobbins as other people, but this is one of the most clear-cut teams in fantasy football.
We are in lockstep with our categories here. Mark Andrews is number 1 off the board for me. Would you dare take him in the first round?
No. I did it last year. I'm no longer taking a tight end in the first round.
Yeah, I did the Kelce in the first round thing last year, and look, Kelce was good, but it was not.
Third seems to be the earliest I'll take one this year.
Yeah, I said Kelce was good last year, but he wasn't first round good last year, so I think I'm off that for me as well. Devin Duvernay is my sleeper, and it really is sort of a dart throw more than anything, just because the passing volume in Baltimore is just not great, and if we know Andrews is going to get probably 150 targets, Rashad Bateman is probably in the neighborhood of 80 to 90 targets. So how much is left for Devin Duvernay? Not really sure, but he seems to be getting at least a little buzz as the second wide receiver there. And for me to avoid, it's any running back after Dobbins. It is just kind of a it's not a who's who, it's a who's that more than anything. So I think I'm staying away from that group pretty much in general.
But Quadzilla's there now.
Oh, that's right. That's right. He is. Yeah, still not doing it.
Yeah.
Still not going there. So there it goes. That is our AFC North preview. We will keep our AFC, our division previews, I should say, going into next week. We'll look at the AFC South coming up on Monday's show.